The purpose of this screencast is to provide a video of the presentation called Minnesota's Newcomers. And you can pause this in order to take notes, so you'll be gathering information from this presentation. The guiding question is, what happens when one group of people come in contact with another group? You're going to see that one group grows almost exponentially and gets much larger than the other group. And of course, we're talking about the native population in Minnesota begins rapidly, just over the course of about 10 years, to get vastly outnumbered by the European or white population. Roman numeral number 1, major population changes in Minnesota. This phrase, Minnesota Territory, will start every single sentence. Minnesota Territory A experienced a population growth from 1849 to 1858. Minnesota Territory B saw mostly European immigrants from eastern port cities flood to Minnesota in search of available land. So a lot of European immigrants weren't able to own land in their home countries and saw Minnesota Territory as an opportunity to do this. And Minnesota Territory C saw its non-Indian or white population grow from 4,852, that's in 1849, to 172,022 people in 1858. That's a massive increase in the white population. Put yourself in the shoes of the native residents that were living in the state for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and how shocking that might have been. This image is of farmers living in southwestern Minnesota, more than likely, probably of European descent or even European, and you have 3 generations here. Continuing, Roman numeral number 1, major population changes in Minnesota. D, by 1860, Minnesota had, and Minnesota's a state at this time, so it's not Minnesota Territory, and we'll find out why later on in the presentation. So by 1860, Minnesota had A, nearly 200,000 non-native residents, B, 7,500 Ojibwe, and C, 7,000 Dakota residents. And when we talked about how the Dakota felt threatened by the U.S. government and the sheer numbers of the white population, you can see there's 200,000 white people living in Minnesota and 7,000 Dakota. You can see why they felt pushed or inclined to sign the treaties. Roman numeral 2, encouraging immigration to Minnesota. Minnesota A became an official U.S. territory in 1849. This means it was pretty much open for settlement. What's interesting is 1849 is before 1851, which is when Traverse des Sioux and Mendota treaties were signed. So the land didn't belong to the U.S. government at this time, yet they claimed it as a U.S. territory. So the government was getting a little ahead of itself. Minnesota B needed more people to meet the population requirements to become a state. And in order to do that, Minnesota C created a government position called the Office of Commissioner of Immigration to Minnesota. And this office, or this person, organized or encouraged new immigrants to the United States and those still in Europe to move to Minnesota. So this is where those recruiters come into play, and they would go throughout the United States and in Europe to get people to come to Minnesota Territory. Roman numeral 3, travel routes to Minnesota. New immigrants arrived from A, England, Ireland, and Scandinavia via New York and Boston. So people born in England, Ireland, and Scandinavia were living in New York and Boston, and recruiters got them to come to Minnesota Territory. B, new immigrants arrived from Norway via Montreal. So Norwegians were living in Canada, and recruiters were able to get them to come to Minnesota. And new immigrants arrived from C, Germany via Baltimore, Maryland. So a number of German immigrants were living in Baltimore, Maryland. Recruiters were able to capture their attention and get them to come to Minnesota. Germans began to account for the largest white population living in Minnesota in those early years of when it was a territory. And new immigrants arrived from D, France, via New Orleans. So they traveled up the Mississippi River and were settled in in and around the Twin Cities, or what would become the Twin Cities area. So when we look at this map, we see there's cities like St. Patrick, New Prague, New Ulm, Heidelberg, Vasa, Scandia, and these cities existed in Europe. So they were taking some of their home culture and even using it in the names of the cities. Also notice that the cities are in the southern part of Minnesota, which is where the farmland is. They weren't interested in the north. It was difficult to farm up there because of it's hilly, lots of lakes, and lots of thick forests. So this was the prairie land that they could farm on. 3. Travel routes to Minnesota continued. New immigrants to Minnesota. E. Traveled north along the Mississippi from New Orleans by way of steamboat. So those are those French immigrants coming up from New Orleans using steamboat. F. New immigrants to Minnesota traveled west through the Great Lakes from New York and Boston, and they came through the Erie Canal, and 1825, Sault-Saint Canal, 1855. So there were canals being built between the different Great Lakes that you could string travel routes together for steamboats to travel through to bring people from the East Coast to Minnesota. New immigrants to Minnesota. G. Traveled west through the Great Lakes from Montreal, so very similar to those people coming from New York and Boston. These would be the Norwegian immigrants coming from Montreal. And new immigrants to Minnesota. H. Traveled west along the Allegheny Mountains and along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers from Philadelphia. So Europeans or even U.S. citizens were coming from Philadelphia and actually traveling overland, the Allegheny Mountains, and then jumping on steamboats and taking the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. And new immigrants to Minnesota. I. Abandoned overland and water routes in favor of trains by the 1850s. So whereas early on they were taking steamboats, a much more reliable and efficient way of travel, which is trains, began to develop in the 1850s. And here is steamboats, more than likely traveling through what looks like kind of the Great Lake chains. And here are some of the routes you can see coming down from Quebec, traveling through the Great Lakes to get to Duluth. You can see coming from Boston, and traveling into rivers, and then connecting through the Great Lakes and arriving into Wisconsin, and then even traveling further on into Minnesota and coming New York. So most of these are waterways using steamboats. And all these water routes were then abandoned because trains were much faster and more efficient. Ojibwe Treaties. Roman numeral number 4. Newcomers. A. Acquired land suitable for farming from the Dakota through treaties during the first half of the 1800s. So Dakota, primarily the U.S. government was dealing with the Dakota first in order to get that land that was for farming. And that's where most of the immigrants settled first. However, newcomers turned their interest toward Ojibwe land in northern Minnesota after the early half of the 1800s. And newcomers were interested in the forests and mineral deposits, mining, in Ojibwe land. So if you've ever been to northern Minnesota, it's very hilly, lots of forests, so you can chop down trees and use the wood, and then you can also access the mineral deposits that are in those hills, iron ore primarily, for the production of steel. So Ojibwe land in the second half of the 1800s became an interest to the U.S. government, and that's when treaties started to be made with the Ojibwe. And newcomers D made treaties with the Ojibwe in 1854, 1855, and throughout the 1860s to acquire this land, and they set up reservations. Those reservations still exist to this day, and you'll notice that these are after certainly the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, which is in 1851. The treaties with the Ojibwe came a little bit later. And that's why we look at this map, and you'll see most of these treaties were made later with the Ojibwe in yellow, and then the treaties that were made with the Dakota are in green. And they were made earlier as 1805, and then we have the Traverse des Sioux in 1851. Here is an image of logging in northern Minnesota, and they would push the logs down the existing streams and riverways, and that's what we're seeing here. And here are miners mining the hills in northern Minnesota for iron ore. Roman numeral 5, the struggle for statehood. So Minnesota's newcomers wished to become a state to have stronger voice in national affairs. They wanted to be able to to participate in elections and create laws. And control of local taxation. If they could make laws, they then could control how they're going to be taxed or how their money is going to be distributed throughout the government. So how much they pay in taxes and where their money goes. So it was an advantage to become a state. You had more of a voice in government. Minnesota's B. Minnesota needed 60,000 people to become a state. So you needed 60,000 people to become a state. Population by 1856 was 150,000, so they certainly met that requirement. So I asked, did they have enough? Well, yeah, of course they did. So what was the holdup? So continuation, Roman numeral 5, the struggle for statehood. Minnesota C. found itself involved in the battle between slave and free states. So in the United States at that time, just before the Civil War, there was a competition between the South and the North to have, not necessarily a competition, but more a push to have an equal amount of slave states and an equal amount of free states. So there was a equal balanced voice in Congress. Minnesota was involved in this. So Minnesota D would have to wait to become a free state until Kansas was admitted as a slave state. So they were waiting for Kansas to get the 60,000 people. Then they could admit Minnesota as a free state and Kansas as a slave state. And Minnesota E was admitted as a free state on January 29, 1858. And this was approved by President James Buchanan on May 11, 1858. So 1858 is when Minnesota became a state. So it was a territory in 1849, a little less than 10 years later became a state. And some review questions to think about. 1. Why did Minnesota have to wait for Kansas to become a state? 2. What did it mean to be a free state? What is a slave state? 3. Why is Minnesota and all the states in the North a free state? This concludes the presentation.